If you've worked with software engineers as much as I have, you start to think of documentation as almost a four-letter word because nobody likes to do it. It's kind of the antithesis of actually getting work done because rather than thinking about the next problem you want to solve, you're thinking about the last problem that you just solved. I work with a lot of startups, and startups have a particular problem with documentation because they're made up of a lot of people who like to go and solve the next thing, and they don't want to worry themselves about the problem that they've already gone through. But of course, this becomes a problem as the company starts to grow and scale. And so today, I'm going to go through two really simple techniques that you can use to help keep control of documentation in your organization. If this is your first time on the channel, my name's Matt Jertson. I'm a former Air Force instructor pilot, and then I led training and development at SpaceX. After that, I started my own company called Better Everyday Studios, where I help companies of all sizes have more impact with their employee training. So let's get started. Documentation is one of those things that just about every company needs, but it starts pretty haphazardly. It's usually not a centralized effort, and instead, different teams who get to the point where they need documentation at different times all kind of find their own way to solve the problem. Ultimately, documentation simply comes down to the idea that once you solve a problem, you want to write down how you solve it, how you do a particular operation, like hiring or firing, or how you write and release code. There's all kinds of documentation, but you need to write it down after you have a standard way of doing it so that the next person you hire doesn't have to resolve that same problem and come up with their own way. You want a standard way of doing things, or else you're going to get non-standard results. But because it's not centralized and everybody starts making kind of their own way to do things, it can get really, really disorganized and really hard to find. So if you can't find the documentation, it might as well not exist. And though there's lots of really impressive softwares out there to manage documentation, when you're a small company just getting started, it can sometimes be overkill, or at least seem like overkill. And so what I want to give you is two simple ways that you can make sure to take control of your documentation using the kinds of tools that you already have. Now, the first thing that I would highly recommend is creating some kind of shared drive structure. In Google Drive, one thing that I've really noticed is that most people don't utilize shared drives. They create documents and everything lives in their own drive. And so what this means is that every time somebody creates a piece of documentation, it lives on that individual's drive and it's really hard to find. This is why very often at the companies that I've seen, people tend to have lots of different tabs opened up because they're worried they're not going to be able to find that document again. A shared drive solves this. The way a shared drive works is the documents inside it are owned by that drive instead of the individual. And so you can set up a whole hierarchy of folders inside that drive, all with their own permissions, and then put all of the documentation there. So then people only have to remember the location of that drive, and then they can find everything else. The other great thing with using this structure is that you can control permissions at the drive level or the folder level as opposed to the document level. Because I'm sure you've had this happen where you create some documentation or somebody on the team created it, they sent it out, and then they get a flurry of requests for access to that documentation. You can change that because you can control the permissions at the folder level, and so then as long as the document is in that folder, all the same people will have access to those documents. So it really simplifies the whole process. It not only makes it easier to find documentation, but it makes it easier to control access to information. The second tip I have is the idea of creating a master document for your documentation. It's similar to the folder structure in that it makes it so it's really easy for people to find documentation in the future. And really all you need to do to get this started is to create one single document which has links to all other documentation. That way people only need to remember the location of this one document, and from there they can find all the other documentation in the company. But you can go a step farther than that and use this document to really set up the structure and format and philosophy behind your documentation. You could use it to write out, the different departments of the company or the different types of documentation that you have, give directions for how to do documentation, organize the documentation into different parts of the master document so it's easier for people to find and easier for people to understand the context in which all of this documentation documentation exists, because that's one thing that can be missing. So if you're struggling with documentation and find that everybody's kind of making their own, this is two simple ways to solve that problem. Put it in some kind of shared drive structure, whether that's something like Dropbox or Google Drive, or also create some kind of master document where all of the documentation in the company has to be referenced from this one document. So it creates the single place where everybody goes if they want to find documentation. If you can do one of those two things, I guarantee you, you're going to have a lot more success organizing your documentation early on. And then it's that much easier to take on kind of a bigger documentation software once you get to that point. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, make sure to like and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time.